Okay, this is the second installment or segment of the lecture to make up for September 29. So we're talking about how we classify organisms in this portion of the lecture. So we talked about how evolution happens. Now we're looking at sort of the actual organisms. So systematics is actually the science of classifying anything, really. So it's the study of taxonomy. Taxonomy is how we classify living organisms. We put them into taxonomic groups. And we do that by looking at certain features. So we say there are two types of features. There are homologous features and there are analogous features, or homologous traits and analogous traits. Homologous traits or features are similar because organisms share an evolutionary relationship. So they share ancestry. So these are homologous traits up here. So the way that our bones are laid out in our upper limbs. Human, you're probably familiar with. Cats actually have the same layout. Whales have the same layout. Bats have the same layout. We're all in the kingdom, well, Animalia, but we're also all mammals. Okay? So this is an evolutionary relationship, and this is one of the things that we share similarities with in these other organisms. Analogous traits are traits that are still similar, but they're not similar because of evolutionary ties and ancestral ties. They're similar just because either you fit similar ecological niches or you use the features in similar ways. So all of these organisms have wings, right? There's bats, there's birds, I don't know what this is, and there's a moth. No similar relationships unless you go all the way back, but they still all have wings, and they use them to fly. So they're not wings because they evolved from a common ancestor. They're wings because they all have ecological niches where they fly. So these are analogous traits down here, and these are homologous traits up here. So when we classify, I keep doing that, when we use taxonomy, we are looking for homologous traits. That will, I can pretty much guarantee it, be a question on your quiz. Which traits do we use when we taxonomically classify organisms? Are they homologous or analogous? They are homologous, because those are the ones that we use because there's shared ancestry. There's a common ancestor there. Okay. Other traits that we look at, other ways that we classify traits themselves, is by whether they're ancestral or derived. And this gets a little more complicated. So an ancestral trait is a trait that we share with ancestors from a long time ago. That makes sense. A derived trait is a trait that is new in a certain organism. Here's the issue. Depending on where you're looking in a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram, which I'll show you in a minute, but it's the tree of organization basically. Depending on where you're looking at in that tree, a trait could look like it's derived, but then if you move somewhere else in the tree, it may be ancestral. So it depends on your perspective, how you would classify this trait. So for instance, this is a whale. Whales actually have hip bones. They do not have legs, but they have hip bones. They're vestigial. They're no longer used. They're there because they have an ancestor who walked on the land. So these bones here are absolutely 100% ancestral. They are shared with ancestors from a long time ago. Now, a derived trait. We will do a lab when we talk about primates that works on taxonomy, and you'll be looking at a lot of different features. And let's see. So, I'm trying to think of one. Thumbs, okay, and mobile digits. If you are comparing primates to a dog, well, a dog doesn't have mobile digits. A dog doesn't have thumbs. So if we look right there, we say, oh, thumbs are a derived trait if we're comparing primates to dogs. But if we are just looking at all primates, monkeys, apes, us, then thumbs actually are ancestral. So that's where where you're looking matters. So derived trait is a trait that's new wherever you happen to be looking. Okay, so we use both ancestral and derived, but derived help us more when we're creating a phylogenetic tree or a phylogeny. So a phylogeny, we're talking about how related different organisms are. And a phylogenetic tree is sort of an illustration of that relatedness. So this is a cladogram. A phylogenetic tree technically shows how far apart organisms are. So this is technically a cladogram, but they basically look the same. So this is showing us evolutionary relationships based on traits that are similar and different from other organisms. So here we can look at ancestral and derived traits. So sharks, ray-finned fish, amphibians, primates, rodents, rabbits, crocodiles, and birds are all on this chart. Down here, here's the presence of a vertebrae. Everything above this red line has a vertebrae. So when we're talking about all of these organisms, a vertebrae is a very ancestral trait. However, here's another one, bony skeleton. Everything above this red line right here has a bony skeleton, which means that sharks do not have a bony skeleton. So if we want to compare ray-finned fish and sharks, well then bony skeleton is a derived trait. It helps us divide everybody else from the sharks. But if we're looking at birds and crocodiles and rodents and rabbits, then a bony skeleton is an ancestral trait. So it depends on where you're looking. So all of these red lines, where they show up, they are a derived trait. But if you look over at the bird and crocodile end, most of them look ancestral. So we really use derived traits where they pop up to create phylogenetic trees. So we will be doing this in a few weeks when we talk about primates. And you'll be doing it with features that primates share and don't share. So this is a really important concept to understand. We use these characteristics to separate organisms and figure out where we are on this evolutionary tree. How related are we? So you really need to understand this. If you don't, come talk to me in class or send me an email to ask me a question. Okay, so let's talk about species evolving. We classify everything in this class, organisms and concepts and everything else. So of course we classify evolution itself. We say that there are a few different ways that evolution happens. You can have divergent evolution. This is when two species that are similar acquire different traits, so they diverge. Okay? So maybe they started as one species and they filled two different ecological niches, and they diverged into two different species. Okay? So divergent, the species diverges into two species. Parallel evolution is when you have two species that are similar. They're not the same species, but they're similar, and they continue to evolve and change, but they basically change similarly. So they're evolving, they're changing, but their relationship to each other always stays about the same. Then you can have convergent evolution. So you have two species that start off very, very different. And as they evolve and change, they actually acquire traits that make them look more similar to one another. So birds and bats are a good example of this. Evolutionarily, they're really not related at all, but they fit these ecological niches where wings are very useful, so they both acquired these wings, and now you look at them and you're like, oh, not that different, even though they are actually very different. So divergent, parallel, and convergent. These images are really, I think, the easiest way to remember which one is which. So we get to this idea of needing to figure out what a species is, and you would think it would be relatively straightforward, but there are 1,010,000 different definitions of what makes a species. I usually adhere to the biological species concept. It's the most common, and I think it makes the most sense. And so it says that if a population can interbreed naturally, then it's a species. So we're going to talk about the things that keep populations from interbreeding naturally, and they're myriad, in fact. But this is a very useful definition. So in nature, if two organisms can produce a viable offspring, then they are in all likelihood from the same species. And in fact, based on this definition, they are of the same species. There are a few things that keep organisms from mating in nature. So we say they're reproductive isolating mechanisms. So they're mechanisms that isolate organisms from reproducing with each other. A sexual reproductive isolating mechanism, means that literally when the organisms try to have sex, the parts usually don't fit with one another. So they cannot have sex. They cannot reproduce. It is just not possible. That's a sexual reproductive isolating mechanism. An ecological reproductive isolating mechanism is basically shown in this little picture. These flies like to reproduce on, let's say this is a mango, I have no idea. They reproduce on mangoes. Love the mangoes. Don't like the bananas. These guys like the bananas, hate the mangoes. These bugs are never going to come into contact with each other because they have different environments. So in primates, we have some primates that live in trees and some that live in grasslands. They're not going to come into contact with each other. So they're not going to reproduce. That's a reproductive isolating mechanism. Now, if you have them in captivity, can they? Maybe. If they don't have one of these other isolating mechanisms. And that's where that species definition gets a little bit tricky. But the definition we work with is in the wild, so these are not the same species because they have totally different environments. They will never reproduce in the wild. Okay. A behavioral reproductive isolating mechanism means that some behavior is keeping them from mating. Usually this is an actual mating behavior. So lots of birds have mating displays and dances. If a bird's supposed to say, show its tail feathers, and then wiggle its left foot, and then wiggle its right foot, and then quack, and then wiggle its left foot again. And that's what the male does to attract a mate. But it's doing this to a female who thinks that you're supposed to wiggle your feet first, and then squawk, and then wiggle them again, and then only at the very end do you wave your tail feathers. Well, then those are two different mating dances. And that female is not going to be attracted to a male that can't do the mating dance properly, so they're behaviorally isolated from one another. Okay. The last one is geographic. So this is a little bit different than ecological. Ecological, these two fruits could be sitting in the same house, and these guys they're on different fruits. Geographic would mean there is something keeping them, like something physical keeping them apart. So it might be a mountain range. It might be a whole ocean. There is something physically isolating two groups from one another. So it's different than ecological. They may both live in grasslands, but they are separated by a mountain range that they will never cross. So they are geographically, reproductively isolated. So these are the 4 reproductive isolating mechanisms. You do need to know them. They keep organisms from mating, which means that the two organisms are probably in 2 different species. Okay. So we're going to stop there for segment 2, start up here for segment 3.